There is a strange irony in modern life. Never has humanity spoken so much about freedom, while being so perfectly conditioned to act without it. You wake up, and your first gesture is not chosen. It's automatic. Your hand reaches for a glowing screen. Your eyes scan for updates. Your mind receives a quiet flood of instructions. Before breakfast, you've already been programmed dozens of times by algorithms, expectations, and emotional triggers so subtle they feel like your own thoughts. A man once told me he felt in control because he could choose what to watch, what to buy, whom to follow. But when asked why he made those choices, his voice trembled. He didn't know. His freedom was decorative, not functional. Manipulation doesn't always wear the face of deception. It often wears the face of familiarity. It is not an external force. It's the invisible architecture beneath every interaction. Every message you read, every smile you interpret, every silence you endure contains a motive, a function, an emotional hook. We tend to imagine manipulation as something malicious, something others do to us. But it's more intricate than that. Manipulation is the grammar of human behavior, the unconscious exchange of emotion for influence. It's how societies organize power, how groups establish hierarchy, how individuals maintain control. Consider the digital age. Your attention has become a form of currency, mined by corporations, traded by algorithms, shaped by design. Every sound, color, and notification is a psychological lever aimed at your reward system. The dopamine circuits of your brain are no longer private. They are public assets. Someone profits every time you feel curious, lonely, or outraged. But the manipulation of attention is only the surface. Beneath it lies the manipulation of identity. You are constantly fed micro-narratives, stories about who you are, what you should value, and whom you should fear. Each like you receive reinforces an image, and each disagreement threatens that same image. The architecture is emotional, not logical. It doesn't control your thoughts. It controls what you feel safe thinking. The most dangerous kind of control is the one that convinces you that obedience is a choice. From families to corporations, manipulation hides behind moral masks: care, loyalty, duty, love. The parent who says, "I only want what's best for you," while imposing their own failed dreams. The employer who calls you family while extracting your time and silence. The partner who demands empathy but never accountability. Every structure of influence disguises its control through language that sounds virtuous. Jung warned us, what we deny in ourselves becomes the instrument of our submission. When you deny your hunger for validation, others use it to command your behavior. When you repress your desire for control, others control you through your own guilt. What you hide becomes the lever they pull. Neurobiology explains the precision of this process. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation, doesn't reward truth. It rewards stimulation. It trains the brain to repeat whatever creates small bursts of pleasure. Social approval, moral superiority, and belonging are all dopaminergic drugs. Cortisol, on the other hand, punishes rejection. Every disapproving look, every subtle exclusion, triggers the same biological cascade as physical threat. You don't obey because you are weak. You obey because your nervous system seeks safety above authenticity. This is the hidden architecture, a system that converts emotion into control, compassion into compliance, and desire into data. Freedom does not begin when you feel free. It begins when you see how you are programmed. when you can detect the invisible scripts operating beneath your behavior. You are not the author of most of your reactions, but you can become the editor. Real autonomy isn't rebellion against power. It's lucidity toward influence. It's the quiet discipline of observing how your mind is moved before moving with it. Every act of awareness cuts a string. Every silent observation weakens a pattern. And the moment you recognize manipulation not as an external evil, but as an inherent structure of human interaction, you stop being its victim and start being its observer. Because the truth is this: everyone manipulates, consciously or not. The question is not whether you are influenced, but whether you know when it happens and why. Freedom, then, is not the absence of control. It is the mastery of perception. And perception begins where illusion ends. To understand manipulation, you must first understand the laziness of the human mind. It doesn't seek truth. It seeks comfort, coherence, and survival. What we call belief is often the byproduct of emotional convenience. We don't think to discover. We think to confirm. This is the first vulnerability, the brain's addiction to patterns that protect its identity. You're not controlled by force, but by familiarity. Manipulation thrives in this space, between what you want to believe and what you fear to question. The process doesn't attack logic. It bypasses it. It enters through emotion, repetition, and bias. The halo effect blinds judgment. One positive trait, status, charisma, appearance, confidence, radiates false virtue over the rest. You assume moral alignment where there is only aesthetic coherence. The attractive, the successful, and the eloquent are granted unearned trust. History is filled with charismatic deceivers who use this single bias as their crown. The social proof mechanism follows. The brain has evolved to equate isolation with danger. When the crowd agrees, dissent feels like death. You conform not because you believe, but because your amygdala warns you that being different is unsafe. We call it culture, but it's biology. Then comes the authority bias, obedience to symbols of certainty. A confident tone, a white coat, a number of followers, an aura of competence, all activate deep circuits of submission. You surrender not to truth, but to the posture of knowing. This triad, halo, group, and authority, forms the invisible cathedral of manipulation. Every ideology, brand, and relationship uses it unconsciously. Look at modern politics. Campaigns no longer sell ideas. They sell identity. They whisper, if you're intelligent, compassionate, aware, you'll agree with us. The manipulation is elegant. Disagreement becomes a threat to your self-image, not your opinion. Once influence fuses with ego, control becomes effortless. The same occurs in intimate relationships. Emotional gaslighting replaces discussion. You're told you're too sensitive, too cold, or too much. The language of care masks psychological warfare. The goal is not persuasion, it's destabilization. When you begin doubting your perception, the manipulator no longer needs to argue. Daniel Kahneman described two mental systems. System 1, fast, emotional, intuitive. System 2, slow, rational, deliberate. System 1 governs survival. System 2 governs analysis. But System 1 is always first. It reacts in milliseconds. System 2 reacts in seconds. And most of life happens in milliseconds. This means you live most of your existence under the rule of instinct, disguised as reasoning. You decide emotionally, then justify intellectually. The manipulation happens before awareness even begins. Machiavelli, centuries earlier, had already diagnosed this. Men are governed by appearances, he wrote. Whoever controls perception controls behavior. The manipulator doesn't conquer you with truth. He organizes your illusions until they look like logic. Consider advertising. It never sells products. It sells psychological continuity. Buy this perfume, and you'll feel desirable. Drive this car, and you'll be respected. It's not commerce. It's symbolic engineering. The object is irrelevant. What matters is the emotional script it fulfills. At a neurological level, manipulation is simply well-timed chemistry. The limbic system, the emotional brain, reacts approximately 250 milliseconds before the prefrontal cortex, where rational analysis occurs. Emotion is first. Logic is commentary. This delay is enough for influence to plant its seed. By the time you decide, the decision has already been made by your nervous system. A skilled manipulator understands this intuitively. He doesn't need to convince you. He just needs to provoke the right emotion, and the rest unfolds automatically. Fear activates obedience. Flattery activates openness. Urgency bypasses deliberation. Guilt creates debt. This is not magic, it's mechanics. The human mind is predictable when you know which buttons to press. But awareness changes everything. The moment you start observing how you feel before you agree, the manipulation begins to unravel. When you feel sudden guilt, urgency, or admiration, pause. These sensations are not random. They are indicators of leverage. They are the fingerprints of influence. Influence hides behind emotional acceleration. The manipulator knows that if he can make you feel fast, he doesn't need you to think deeply. That is why clarity always begins with deceleration. Take any situation in which you feel pressured, seduced, or confused. Slow down. Ask, what emotion is being triggered? Who benefits from this feeling? What belief is this trying to reinforce? Most manipulation loses power under analysis. Like shadows, it depends on darkness. Yet there is a paradox here, and this is where philosophy meets psychology. Even though we can study influence scientifically, it never fully disappears. Awareness doesn't delete manipulation. It transforms your relationship with it. You can't remove emotion from decision-making. What you can do is integrate emotion into awareness. You can feel and still observe. The manipulator wants you to be only emotional or only rational, because extremes are predictable. Integration makes you unreadable. To live lucidly is not to distrust everyone. It's to see the machinery of persuasion without losing empathy. It's to understand how every sentence, image, and silence can shape the psyche, while maintaining sovereignty of interpretation. Philosophers like Nietzsche and Stoics like Epictetus converge on the same insight. Mastery of the mind is not achieved by escaping influence, but by governing response. When you become conscious of the architecture of persuasion, something changes internally. You stop reacting. You start watching. You see the emotional bait without taking it. You become the observer of your own programming. And in that stillness, not in rebellion, not in noise, begins the first taste of freedom. Because manipulation isn't evil by nature. It's simply the language of human power. What matters is who uses it, and for what purpose. The goal is not to be untouched, but to be unconquered. To see how emotion and reason dance, and choose when to lead. There is a hidden weakness that governs even the strongest minds. The need to be seen, understood, or loved. It's not a physical weakness, it's emotional dependency, the subtle addiction to approval. The manipulator doesn't need chains or violence. He only needs your hunger for validation. Once he identifies what you crave, control becomes effortless. People believe they are enslaved by others, but in truth, they are enslaved by their own unexamined needs. You can observe this everywhere. The employee who says yes to unreasonable demands to avoid disapproval. The friend who absorbs the chaos of others just to feel significant. The partner who stays silent in conflict because peace feels safer than self-respect. The citizen who believes the news that comforts him, not the one that informs him. All are bound by the same invisible thread, the fear of disconnection. Human beings are social organisms. The brain associates acceptance with survival. Rejection, even in symbolic form, activates the same neural regions as physical pain. This is why criticism can feel like injury. It's why silence from someone you care about can feel like suffocation. The nervous system interprets rejection as threat, and under threat, the mind seeks to adapt, not to rebel. This is where manipulation finds its strongest foundation. When someone can make you feel unworthy, unsafe, or unapproved, they can program your behavior without touching you. Psychologically, this is the conditioning of compliance. Early experiences, especially in childhood, train the nervous system to associate obedience with love. When affection is conditional, you learn that being accepted is more important than being authentic. You internalize a rule. If I please others, I am safe. And that belief becomes the perfect software for external control. Many adults still operate under that childhood code. They just call it empathy, patience, or kindness. They believe their capacity to endure disrespect is a virtue. But often, it's fear wearing a moral mask. Jung's concept of the shadow exposes this illusion. Those who deny their own capacity to manipulate or dominate become unconscious victims of others' will. By refusing to acknowledge the darker elements of their psyche, their own need for control, attention, or superiority, they externalize power. They see manipulation as something others do. And in that denial, they become programmable. The shadow they repress in themselves becomes the leash others use. This is why people who consider themselves good are often the easiest to exploit. They define their worth by self-sacrifice. They confuse guilt with responsibility. They fear confrontation because it threatens their identity as kind. But kindness, when detached from lucidity, becomes a weapon against its owner. The manipulator reads this dependency instantly. He mirrors empathy, mimics vulnerability, and offers emotional currency in exchange for control. He gives validation in doses, never too much, just enough to keep you returning. This is not affection, it's behavioral conditioning. Neuroscience provides the biochemical map. Every time you receive approval, a compliment, a text, a gesture of attention, your brain releases dopamine. That reward reinforces the behavior that preceded it. You become addicted not to the person, but to the chemical response they trigger. When approval is withdrawn, cortisol rises. Anxiety floods your system. Your body demands restoration. You reach out again. And the cycle continues. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, deepens the trap. It fosters trust and emotional attachment, even when logic warns against it. This is why victims of manipulation often defend their manipulators. They are not defending logic. They are defending the chemical illusion of safety. This dynamic explains why entire societies can be controlled without violence. The mechanism is emotional. If you can convince people that obedience is virtue and doubt is betrayal, they will police themselves. The chains become internal, made of guilt, fear, and moral confusion. Nietzsche called this phenomenon slave morality, the glorification of submission as ethical superiority. People learn to call weakness, compassion, dependence love, and obedience virtue. It's the psychology of inversion, where self-sacrifice is celebrated and self-respect is condemned as arrogance. The manipulator doesn't need to impose power when the victim's morality does the work. You can witness this in personal relationships, workplaces, and even nations. The pattern is universal. The leader, the partner, the parent, all using affection, duty, or guilt to preserve control. The subject, believing he's doing the right thing, continues to comply. It's not stupidity, it's conditioning. Breaking this loop requires brutal honesty. Ask yourself, why do I seek approval from those who disrespect me? Why does rejection hurt more than deception? When did I start confusing harmony with submission? These are not moral questions, they are neurological. Your brain was trained to equate love with compliance. To break the pattern, you must rewire that association. It begins with discomfort, the courage to feel unloved, unseen, or misunderstood without bending to fix it. That discomfort is the detox from dependency. Once you endure it long enough, you begin to notice something profound. Your worth does not decrease in silence. Your value does not vanish when approval does. And that realization is the first taste of psychological sovereignty. Every manipulator thrives on emotional urgency. When you stop chasing reassurance, you become unpredictable. When you stop explaining yourself, you become unreadable. When you stop needing to be liked, you become untouchable. Autonomy is not emotional coldness. It's emotional clarity. It's the ability to feel empathy without selling your freedom. There's a difference between caring and depending, between understanding and obeying. True connection cannot exist between puppeteer and puppet. Real love, whether romantic, familial, or spiritual, does not require submission. It thrives in freedom, not in control. It respects difference, not conformity. To be lucid is not to stop feeling. It's to feel consciously. To know that compassion can coexist with boundaries. To realize that saying no is not cruelty, but integrity. Remember, the need to be liked is the cheapest leash ever invented. The one who masters solitude masters influence. Because when you no longer need to be fed, you cannot be starved. The most sophisticated form of control is not domination. It's participation. You collaborate with your own manipulation every time you trade truth for comfort, silence for approval, or authenticity for peace. External control survives only through internal permission. The manipulator cannot maintain influence without your cooperation. Your rationalizations, your guilt, your excuses. We are taught early that obedience equals goodness, and that confrontation equals chaos. This is how manipulation becomes moralized, how self-betrayal becomes virtue. You are told that keeping the peace is noble. You are told that understanding others is maturity. But what if both are just refined forms of submission? Consider how often you've apologized for something that wasn't wrong, simply to restore harmony. How often you've explained yourself excessively, not to clarify, but to be forgiven for existing differently. How often you've bitten your tongue, smiled when disrespected, or minimized pain to avoid being seen as difficult. These are not random behaviors. They are rituals of control learned in silence. The manipulator doesn't need to silence you. He only needs you to silence yourself. And you do it well under the disguise of patience. You tell yourself you're avoiding unnecessary conflict, but what you're truly avoiding is the discomfort of self-assertion. You tell yourself you're choosing peace, but what you're really choosing is predictability, a peace that depends on your compliance. This is the paradox of control. No one enslaves you without your help. Every time you rationalize disrespect, they didn't mean it, it's not worth it, I'll let it go, you reinforce the system. The more you tolerate what hurts you, the more invisible you become to yourself. Psychology calls this learned helplessness, a state where repeated submission conditions the mind to stop resisting. After enough exposure to control, even freedom feels dangerous. The cage becomes home because it is familiar. Another mechanism at play is the Pygmalion effect, the tendency to conform to others' expectations. When people label you as the calm one, the responsible one, the understanding one, you unconsciously perform that role. You become predictable, programmable, shaped by other people's narratives. The irony is cruel. The more you try to maintain harmony, the less peace you actually feel. Because real peace requires honesty, and honesty often disturbs. Manipulation thrives where truth is avoided. Many call it love, the willingness to forgive endlessly, to understand without limits, to give without reciprocity. But love without boundaries is not love. It is absorption. You can see this dynamic in every social structure. The friend who constantly rescues others and ends up resented. The employee who works overtime for the team, while their silence funds exploitation. The partner who accepts emotional neglect and calls it loyalty. All of them serve the same illusion, that endurance equals virtue. But the truth is colder. Endurance without awareness is self-erasure. You become complicit when you believe that your role is to absorb, rather than to act, to adapt, rather than to define. Jung taught that what we repress becomes our fate. If you repress your inner manipulator, the part of you that wants control, influence, and dominance, you don't destroy it. You externalize it. You project it onto others, and then become submissive to it. By pretending to be entirely innocent, you become entirely controlled. To reclaim freedom, you must confront this inner manipulator, not to become corrupt, but to become complete. You must accept that you too are capable of influence, that power flows through you, whether you admit it or not. Only by integrating that awareness can you stop being naive. Because naivety is not kindness. It's blindness disguised as purity. When you finally stop rescuing others from their own chaos, you will be accused of selfishness. When you stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you, you will be called arrogant. When you stop playing the role of emotional caretaker, you will be told you've changed. In truth, you've only stopped collaborating. This is how manipulation hides, not in open oppression, but in moral inversion. It convinces you that self-respect is cruelty and silence is virtue. Breaking this cycle is not an act of rebellion, but of precision. It begins with observation. Notice when you shrink your presence to protect someone else's comfort. Notice when you explain your truth, as if seeking permission to exist. Notice when guilt appears the moment you choose yourself. That guilt is not conscience, it's conditioning. It's the echo of an old system losing control. Biologically, every act of self-assertion rewires the brain. When you resist manipulation, when you pause before reacting, when you say no calmly, when you allow disapproval without collapse, you activate your prefrontal cortex. This region governs planning, impulse control, and strategic awareness. Each small act of lucidity strengthens it. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the center of fear and emotional urgency, begins to lose its grip. In other words, clarity is not only psychological, it's neurological training. With time, you'll notice something subtle but transformative. Peace no longer means agreement. Kindness no longer means surrender. And silence no longer means weakness. It becomes a form of command. Existentially, the cost of constant peacekeeping is immense. When you prioritize comfort over truth, you slowly dissolve. You lose the capacity to confront, to define, to lead. You become a shadow within your own life, polite, pleasant, and powerless. True lucidity requires disillusionment. You must see how much of your virtue was fear, how much of your empathy was self-preservation, how much of your silence was a strategy for acceptance. His is not cynicism, it's clarity. Because control only thrives where honesty dies. The manipulator depends on your avoidance of discomfort. Once you are willing to feel uneasy, to let the air grow tense, the silence heavy, manipulation loses oxygen. There is power in not explaining. There is control in measured stillness. There is strength in observing without reacting. The world is full of people trying to provoke you into becoming predictable. Don't give them that satisfaction. Observe. Don't react. Choose lucidity over approval, because the moment you stop collaborating with your own manipulation, silence becomes sovereignty. And in that stillness, for the first time, you are no longer part of someone else's strategy. You are your own. Freedom is not rebellion. It's awareness. You don't escape manipulation by rejecting it. You escape it by seeing it as it happens. The real battlefield isn't the world. It's your reaction to it. The mind becomes programmable when it loses its capacity to observe itself. When every emotion becomes impulse, every thought becomes identity, and every discomfort becomes something to avoid. You become predictable. Predictability is the language of control. Autonomy begins when you reclaim your inner observer, the part of you that watches thought without obeying it. It's not detachment, it's command. When you can watch anger rise without feeding it, or notice guilt without kneeling to it, you begin to govern the internal algorithms that once ruled you. Ancient philosophers understood this centuries before neuroscience could explain it. Epictetus said, "No one can harm you unless you consent to believe you are harmed." The Stoic wasn't naive. He understood the fundamental architecture of control. Perception is the gatekeeper of power. Sun Tzu echoed the same principle in a different form. He who knows himself and the enemy will never be defeated. In psychological warfare, the enemy is not the manipulator. It's your unexamined emotion. Every influence depends on reaction. The manipulator cannot control what he cannot provoke. And so the true practice of autonomy is not resistance, but calibration. The discipline of regulating the mind before it is moved by external forces. Neuroscience confirms this ancient truth. Mindfulness practice. The ability to observe without judgment. literally reshapes the brain. Studies show increased gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and self-regulation. Simultaneously, amygdala activity, the source of emotional hijacking, decreases. You become less reactive, less programmable. Stillness becomes neurological strength. But autonomy is not just about defense. It's about creation. Once you stop being programmed, you must design your own system. A mind without direction is a target. A mind with purpose is a fortress. Define your principles as you would define code. Precise, minimal, absolute. For example, I do not chase what requires my self-betrayal. I observe before I decide. I owe honesty to myself before harmony with others. These are not affirmations. They are algorithms. They tell the mind how to process reality. Freedom is sustained not by motivation, but by mental architecture. Every morning you rebuild it. Through silence, reflection, and discipline. You filter your inputs. You measure your emotions. You act from structure, not impulse. The manipulator wants you to forget this. Power is not loud. It's measured. Noise is distraction. Calm is control. In this sense, solitude becomes a tool of refinement. When you are alone, no one is programming you but yourself. That's where you learn who you are without interference, where you can separate internal truth from external suggestion. Most people fear solitude because it exposes how much of their personality was a social costume. But that discomfort is liberation in disguise. It's the sound of the system rebooting. Autonomy isn't coldness, it's clarity. It doesn't reject emotion, it integrates it. It doesn't isolate, it refines connection. Because only the autonomous can truly love, not from need, but from choice. Every moment of silence becomes a mirror, and the mirror cannot be manipulated. It reflects, but it does not absorb. This is the final evolution of awareness. Reflection without absorption. The world will continue to manipulate through media, ideology, affection, fear. That's inevitable. But once you see the mechanisms clearly, you stop participating unconsciously. You scroll differently. You listen differently. You love differently. You speak less, but each word carries intention. You become the observer in a world of performers, calm, lucid, precise. This is not detachment from life. It's mastery of it. You live among illusions without becoming one. You navigate persuasion without being possessed by it. Lucidity is not comfort. It's control. It doesn't make life easier. It makes it real. And reality, once faced directly, no longer frightens. True power is not resistance. It's discernment within chaos. You can't control the waves, but you can control the vessel. And through that control, the storm becomes irrelevant. Because manipulation loses meaning once you stop reacting. A string cannot pull what stands still. And silence, the kind that observes, not hides, becomes the purest form of dominance. So the final practice of autonomy is simple, but absolute. Observe. Don't react. Choose lucidity over emotion. And remember, influence ends where awareness begins. The world manipulates everyone, but not everyone remains unconscious. Those who see the architecture no longer live inside it. And once you see the strings, no one can pull them. Silence is your defense. Observation is your weapon. Lucidity is your freedom. I choose lucidity.